much for coming. If we haven't met, I think I recognise most of you, but if we haven't met before, I'm James Kirkup. I'm the director of the Social Market Foundation. You are, I hope you know, here for this fringe event in conjunction with our partners at Opinium, talking about the centre ground. Quick word of advertising for the SMF. If you're not familiar with us, we are a cross-party centre ground think tank based at Westminster, trying to do lots of things that these days are terribly unfashionable, like bringing politicians together in the middle, make policy on the basis of evidence, all those things. That don't worry, it'll come back into fashion in one day. This event is, in many ways, it's a follow-up on some work we did with Opinium 5 years ago now, looking at public opinion. Where is the centre ground? We're a centre ground think tank, so we talk about the centre a lot. So it's only fair that we try and establish where that centre is, where what are the points of common agreement on voters. Where's the electorate? Obviously, an interesting question to anybody involved in politics. In terms of running order, in a minute I will hand over to Adam Drummond from Opinium, who will put up some slides and talk you through the opinion research we've been doing, trying to understand where the electorate is, particularly with regard to the Labour Party, this big Labour Party conference. I should say we'll do this event again in symmetrical form at the Conservative Party conference in Manchester next week. If any of you are serious attenders of the conference, I hope to see you there too. So Adam will talk you through some slides. We will then, he says, checking his notes in a not at all professional way. We will then hear from Sonia. Sonia's going next. Sonia Sodha, chief leader, writer of The Observer and writer of one of the must-read columns of the day at the moment. To confess, I'm a former newspaper journalist and rich believer that columnists go through phases of form, and at the moment Sonia is definitely on the up at the moment. Thank you. We'll talk about this later on. I used to write a column, honestly. We all go through phases where you just phone it in for a few weeks at a time. But anyway, Sonia's really good at the moment, so read Sonia in the Observer. And then finally, we will hear from Stephen Kinnock, who is currently glorying in the title of Grand High Commissar of Labour Renaissance. The internal factory of ideas and energy that will transform Labour and lead back to the glory days of insert your chosen period of history here. Yes, we'll get to that. Yes, indeed. We will get to that. Anyway, so with the opening thoughts from all of them, I might talk a bit. I'll try not to, I promise. Then we will get your questions and comments. I think it's a big room. Lots of people here. It's good when we get to questions and comments. One of my colleagues will bring you a microphone, and if you don't ask a question, or at least pretend to ask it by raising the inflection of your voice at the end of the sentence, then I will shout at you because I don't like speeches. I like questions. So that's about all. Have I missed any housekeeping stuff? Do I need to talk about the fire escapes are? Okay, if there's a fire, run for that door screaming. Also, the internet, the delay was because we were just getting that camera up online. We're also live streaming this to the SMF YouTube channel because we're modern like that. What that means is that when we get to questions, you are not just talking to your dear friends in this room, you're also talking to the infinite cyberspace out there full of Russian sex bots. So bear in mind that your question will be on YouTube forever. Maybe used against you. This is worth bearing in mind for you too, Steve. That, I think, is it for the housekeeping. Now on to the main programme. Ta-da-da! Adam Drummond.
How I follow that. So this is essentially, well, some background. So as James said, 5 years ago, just after the referendum, there was a lot of talk about what's the centre ground, is the centre ground dead, etc. And we had the catchy title of Dead Centre. And really what we were trying to work out here was, obviously we just had, I did need to ask, can everyone hear all right? Do I need to sort of swallow the microphone a bit more? Is that all right? I'm going to take that as yes.
I think we're requesting for more from either closer to the microphone or just speaking up. Is that right? I think is your mic working out?
Let's find out.
Yeah. Okay. Good. I think we're good.
So I'll keep Frankly, go. So one of the things we were trying to find out was, if you didn't have the sort of existing party system that we have, where would people kind of naturally fall out? If we had sort of a Germany-style, PR system, for example, where would the natural kind of groupings occur? Because lots of talk about the centre ground. The traditional way of thinking about it, obviously, was that it was sort of, the Labour version is being a bit more sort of fiscally conservative, the Tory version of being a bit more socially liberal. But actually, the sort of white space, the unoccupied ground, back in sort of 2015-16 was actually the almost exact opposite of that. It was being more sort of economically left-leaning and being quite sort of socially right-leaning, which is obviously what ended up happening with the Conservative Party when sort of the Brexit Party votes in the 2019 election. So anyway, the reason we're saying this is that the way that we approached this was coming up with about 15 or so different sort of key divides in politics, different issues. So each one was formed of sort of two opposing statements, and then we basically just asked people to place themselves between those. And then it all goes into a cluster analysis and goes into basically a stat machine, and it spits out various sort of naturally occurring groups. So this is how it appeared back in 2016. Without going into all the sort of detail of what these are sort of arranged from left to right according to how they perceive themselves to be on the left-right spectrum. So the people who fell into what sort of democratic socialist group, they're the ones who perceive themselves to be very left-wing. The people who fell into the Britain group, and that's purple for a reason, they perceive themselves to be the most right-wing group. So very brief sort of rundown, really, what we'll see here is you've got the democratic socialist group. It's very much what it says in the tin. Community group was more of a sort of like blue Labour type group, so economically quite left-wing, quite socially conservative. Progressives are your sort of new Labour type, the sort of slightly more sort of economically conservative, quite socially liberal, but still firmly in sort of the left camp. Swing voters, again, does what that says in the tin. New Britain and Free Liberals, the differences there are a bit sort of minor and marginal, but we think of them as essentially being the sort of Cameron Osborne end of the Tory spectrum. And then you'll notice that some of these columns are much taller than others. The common sense group, we think of common sense really more in the way that the term common sense gets used by tabloids, that sort of thing. Like it's the original name we had for them was kind of the non-ideological right. It's people who don't have sort of strongly held political beliefs, but they have a firm idea of what they think of as kind of the common sense solution to things. And then the Britain group is very much the sort of the Tory UKIP swing voters. Again, back in 2016 when UKIP was a thing. So they are, interestingly, they were a bit more sort of economically left-wing than a lot of the other Tory groups, but socially very right-wing. So that's how things were in 2016. Yes, I think have changed. Basically, the tribes that are broadly sort of on the left have increased in size slightly, and there's been a decrease in size of the tribes that we think of as being on the right. So the common sense group has gone down a couple of points, the Britain group has gone down quite a few points. And on the sort of left side of things, each of those have inched up a bit, but particularly in that kind of community group. And so we think there's a certain amount of crossover there, moving from the sort of Britain group to the community group. And this is down to a couple of things. One of them is that basically the public has sort of moved gradually to the left on both economics and immigration over the last 5 years. So these are some of the statements that we included in the model that we used to generate those tribes in the first place. So people should be allowed to earn whatever they want, versus it's important that society doesn't get too unequal. And so you can see basically there's a change from 29% saying that it's important that society isn't too unequal. That's jumped up to 44%. The percentage saying the opposite has shrunk from 53 to 37%. And then this other one on the right, it's the government should do what it can to make Britain a more equal society, versus that's not the government's job at all. The pink one hasn't really changed that much, and yes, the net hasn't really changed that much either. But the sort of big block at the bottom, that 35 to 42%, that's people ticking like the end of the scale. So people ticking the government should definitely strongly believe this, make society more equal. So that's the interesting sort of increase to pay attention to there. So that's on the economic side. And then on the immigration side, two of the sets of statements that we use for that, one of them is fairly basic. Do you think immigration is a net benefit or a net burden on society? And that's essentially flipped. So it's gone from in 2016, 40% saying it's more of a burden, 32% saying it's more of a benefit. And now it's flipped around, 32% saying it's more of a burden, 42% saying it's more of a benefit. And that partly reflects two things. One of them is that in tracking surveys of what are the issues that the public think are most important facing Britain at the moment, immigration has been on, it peaked in 2016, as you might expect, and then it's gradually been on a sort of long-term decline since then, both in surveys where we present people with lists of things and ask them to tick, and in ones where you just ask them to open text answer. So you ask them to say what's on their mind about it rather than prompt them with answers. And also one of the things I think is interesting we've seen since 2016 is a lot more positive arguments for immigration, rather than just sort of damage mitigation arguments, saying that it's not as bad as is made out to be. I think that's really kind of behind some of the change here. And then the other one that we have on the right here is we ask people whether British is a civic identity, which anybody can have if they move to this country from elsewhere and adopt values and assimilate, etc. Or is it an ethnic identity? Do you have to be born here to be able to say that you're British? And again, there's a shift towards more people saying the civic option, the more kind of open to the world idea of British, rather than the kind of more sort of ethno-nationalist type version. And again, the big change, it's the people ticking the sort of hardest liberal option there. So the 26 blue block at the bottom to the 35, that's the biggest increase we see there. So when this comes down to parties, this is basically when we split each party's supporters by which of these tribes they fall into. So yes, like the underlying sort of situation for Labour is that things seem to be moving in a slightly more positive direction. The public's moving left on economics and social values, which is a good thing for a party at the centre left. But the underlying problem still remains, which is that Labour's vote is split between lots of smaller groups, whereas the Tories' vote is very much concentrated in the bigger groups. So you can see basically Labour's split between, almost evenly between our Democratic Socialist group, our Progressives group, our Community group, whereas the Tories is 40% in our Common Sense group. And the upshot of that is basically that just, Common Sense tells you that is a much harder coalition for Labour to hold together and much easier for the Tories to hold together in terms of competing viewpoints. The other thing also is that, so not only is Labour sort of home to more kind of diverse and more competing viewpoints, they're also, it seems, much more strongly held, which is an advantage and a disadvantage, as we'll see. So Labour's other problem is that, as I said, Labour voters in our sample were much more likely to tick the ends of the scales. So the definite option, definitely this or definitely that, rather than I don't have a strong view or, being a bit less of a certain in their beliefs. So out of 15 statements, 60% of Labour voters ticked the extreme end of one of the scales in half of them or more, versus only 38% of Conservative voters. So Labour is this combination of lots of different groups with lots of diverging views that are all very strongly held. And it's kind of no wonder, I guess, that it's sort of herding cats trying to keep all of this together. By comparison, I mean, the phrase that gets chucked around, the Tories are basically sort of playing politics on the easy setting by having this much more sort of homogenous group of opinions that they have to hold together. So the final bit is that Labour also got a bit of a sort of purity problem. So one of the questions that we asked a couple of weeks ago, how would you feel about a friend or family member if you found out that they voted this way, that way, the other way? So the general sort of picture, if you look at the top level, it's mostly, it's like where you are in the middle. It wouldn't affect either way. Slightly more people say, like, the net balance is that, finding out somebody voted Labour makes slightly more people think positively of you. Finding out somebody voted Conservative on net makes somebody feel slightly more negatively about you. But actually, if you look at just the different parties, so this is just Conservative voters, and it's overwhelmingly, if you're a Tory, you feel slightly more positive about somebody if you find out they voted Conservative, but by and large, it doesn't seem like that has so much of an impact. By comparison, if you look at Labour voters, it's pretty stark. So 40% of Labour voters said they feel more negatively about a friend or family member if you found out. Friend or family member, not complete stranger, if you found out they voted Conservative, 36% if you found out they voted Leave in the EU referendum. And so there's a couple of explanations or reasons for this that we're chucking around and thinking about. One of my sort of theories is that basically this is what it's like being on the losing side, where I feel it's much easier to be kind of magnanimous about people with differing political views if your side has won the election and won every major vote in the last 10, 15 years. But the other possibility is that, again, it stems from that fact that Labour's coalition hold their views much more strongly. And so, to an extent, I suppose Labour voters are a bit like too into politics to be a sort of conveniently manageable coalition. Which again, there's pros and cons to that, but in terms of holding a group together and having this sort of, purity sort of view of insiders and outsiders, that is possibly going to sort of hold them back in the long term.
Thank you very much. Excellent. We will, I'm not quite sure when, but we will put those slides, they would be hard to see from the back, we will be putting those slides up on the SMF website. That may have to wait until next week after the Conservative event, but in due course, you'll be able to get copies of all of those slides and charts. So thank you, Adam. With little further ado, I will hand over to Sonia for her lacerating analysis of the polling and where that leaves Labour.
Brilliant, thanks so much. I thought it was so fascinating. So thanks for that, Adam. And I think what I'll do is I'll focus on the implications of a couple of the things that you drew out for sort of what I think the implications are for how the left conducts debates and politics. Yeah. So the two bits that really stood out to me, and it's quite interesting because actually they weren't, I didn't feel surprised looking at this stuff, and maybe lots of you don't as well. So I think the purity problem is an issue, and it's an issue that actually I observe with my friends. I have some friends who definitely think lesser of me because of the columns I write. In fact, I write for the Observer, and these are friends who sort of are from the far left, I suppose, of the Labour tradition, and I can definitely feel that in personal relationships. So it's, it definitely sort of bears out for me. And I would say actually it's very interesting looking at that analysis of voters. My suspicion would be that if you look at members, it might be even stronger. Yeah. And that's particularly important, I think, for the Labour Party.
We may do a show of hands from the audience.
But I thought the other really fascinating bit was that graph that shows how Labour voters split so much more widely across the 9 political tribes. And in many ways, again, that's reinforcing something we've already got a sense of coming out from Brexit, which I think was a symptom of that different sort of, the differing alignments between the two parties and the way that sort of Brexit acted to the benefit of the Conservatives, but I think really was very, very tricky has been very tricky for Labour to negotiate over the last 3 or 4 years. So I guess the implications to me are really about how, in an age where political discourse feels like it's becoming increasingly polarised and toxified, I think, and I think that is partly as a result of this Conservative government and the way that they choose to pick culture wars issues as territory to fight on, and we can see actually why it could work quite well, why they might feel like it could work quite well for them, although I'm sceptical it's going to work as well as they think. But also, I think the polarisation of the debate does come from actually debates on the left and the way that certain parts of the left conduct debates too. And I think it's easy sometimes to forget that debate on social media and in political circles doesn't reflect what's going on in the country at large. So I think, there is no way that debate around kitchen tables, to the extent that it's, people talk about these issues, is conducted in the same terms that it is on Twitter, for example. So that's something that's very important to say. But at the same time, we live in an age where the way that debate is conducted on Twitter really does infect the way real-world politics works. And I personally think you can see that in the way that both sides have been sort of conducting themselves, although I think there are sort of particular examples, including from this conference. And so I suppose for me, taking a step back, and I've written a lot about this in my columns, progressive social change happens when people who feel very passionately about it and have a particular worldview on the issue are able to convince people who don't think like them that this is something they should care about. And that for me is like a fundamental it has to be a fundamental motivating force of successive progressive change. And I think there are a couple of examples, there are so many examples in history, but recently there have been a couple of very good examples of where that's happened. So the campaign for equal marriage in the US, we saw a really extraordinary shift in public attitudes towards equal marriage in the US. And I think that partly comes down to, speaking to sort of experts who sort of watch this unfold, partly comes down to the nature of the campaign and the fact that at some point campaign is sort of shifted from doing it very much in the language of, this is about rights and you must think like us. And quite frankly, that is my worldview. That's how I think about equal marriage as well. It's a right, and anyone who doesn't see that right, but you can't convince people like that. And so the campaign, if you read accounts of how it sort of shifted, it became very much about, actually it was grounded in conservative values of love and family, and everyone's got a right to this. And that was actually much more effective in changing people's minds and helped create that extraordinary shift that happened over quite a short space of time, relatively, in public attitude. I think another really amazing example of it is the campaign for abortion reform in Ireland. And I dread to think what would have happened if Irish abortion campaigners had gone out and said, everyone who does not believe in a woman's right to choose is a horrible bigot, and you don't get what it is to be a woman, and you're so wrong. Thank God they didn't do that. The campaign was really intelligent, and it was basically said it didn't try and make people who have, often in Ireland, of course, it's because of religious belief, it didn't try and make them feel like they were terrible people. It was a very, very pragmatic argument. It was like, look what this means for your mothers, your sisters, your aunts, your daughters, having to travel to Liverpool by themselves. Like, how awful is that? And this stuff is going to go on regardless of your beliefs about abortion and whether it's right or wrong morally. And is that really okay? And that was the campaign. And so I think those are two very powerful examples where social justice campaigners have been like, right, we're not going to tell people on the other side they're evil, nasty, horrible people because they don't think like us and they don't see the world in the way that we do. We're going to try and communicate them in language to them in language that works for them, in the case that works for them. And we're all different and we all find different things convincing. So I think that's really important. There's just a couple of other examples that I want to chuck in. One is around wealth and attitudes to wealth. So I'm on the board of a charitable foundation called the Trust for London, and our mission is to reduce poverty and inequality in London, and we fund work to do that. And we're quite a bit unusual as a philanthropic foundation. We fund a lot of on-the-ground services work, but we also fund work around campaigning to try and understand better how to make the political case against poverty and inequality. And we funded some work a couple of years ago on wealth and attitudes to wealth. And actually, it was a really interesting piece of work. It was done by the people who run the Minimum Income Standard project, which is all around kind of understanding what public consensus is around a minimum standard of living that people should be able to have in this country. And if you fall below that, it's just completely unacceptable. And that actually gives you a living wage, which is much higher than the national living wage. So it's a very interesting approach. And what this research was looking to do was try and understand, actually, are there similar attitudes to like wealth where people just think, oh, there's a consensus, like that's just too much. Anyway, the research was really interesting. It doesn't work like that for wealth. And some really profound things came out about the way that people see people who are wealthy. And they do not see people who are wealthy in the same way that Jeremy Corbyn sees people who are wealthy. So it's considered to be very respectable and admirable. If people see people who are very wealthy often, unless there's real reasons to think not, that they deserve that wealth and they work really hard to achieve it. Now, of course, I don't think we live in a meritocracy. But people very strongly believe in meritocracy, and you've got to do a lot of work to convince people that Britain isn't quite as meritocratic as they think, because it's quite a deeply held instinctive belief, to try and make them see the world your way. So this is why I think the many against the few rhetoric was so damaging to Labour, actually, because everyone sees that rhetoric and they sort of think, well, I either am the few or I aspire to be the few, so who's this really speaking to? So I think that's really important. And then the other sort of example I wanted to chuck in there on this stuff was, so I've been doing some work with a housing charity on social housing this year, and thinking about how you talk to the public about social housing and how you make the case for a big programme of public investment in housing like we used to have. And again, some really interesting stuff came out from that research, which was, first of all, people obviously don't see housing the way that housing campaigners do. They think if your house has gone up in value a lot, it's because you made good decisions, you bought at the right time. Sure, it's a little bit unfair, but it's not like there's this immoral accumulation of wealth. But what was really interesting was we tested different ways of advocating for more social housing, and the very political arguments just didn't work. Like, people don't like the government being blamed for stuff when they feel like it's a bit unfair. And I don't mean like it's all the Tories' fault. I actually mean like successive governments over decades have got this wrong. The arguments that worked much better were we've got a big social problem in this and we need to take action to address this, and this is what the government could do, rather than blaming the government for a lack of action over the last 3 or 4 decades, which I do blame government for, but that is not, I found that really, really interesting, and I thought that was quite instructive, because so much of the political discourse at the moment on the left is about blaming the government for stuff. Quite rightly, in my view, that's what we do a lot of in the Observer editorial column, but I'm not sure that that's that effective with voters. And I do think, sorry, I'll just go on for like 1 more minute and then I'll shut up. I do think that there is a big divide on the left at the moment. I wrote about this in my column at the weekend, where there are different perspectives on how you get to social change. And, I've sort of been clear about what my perspective is. There is another perspective, and I think it's quite well epitomised by, I think America's in a completely different place on this, but the debate, particularly around race in the US and around a concept called white fragility. That's actually, interestingly, been written about by an anti-racist campaign who's white. Her name's Robin DiAngelo, but there are other people who really sort of have written about this school of thought. And it's basically that if you are unwittingly complicit in structural discrimination, or you've benefited from structural discrimination in society, and bear in mind, most people don't really know what structural discrimination is, you're kind of a terrible person. And you should feel really guilty and horrible about yourself. And you better bloody get on our side, because you're just kind of quite terrible. I find this quite an appalling way to bring about social change, because it doesn't, first of all, I don't believe in making people feel terrible about themselves if they're not really badly intentioned, but that's a whole philosophical debate that we can talk about. But second, it just doesn't work. So on a pragmatic level, making people feel really crap about themselves is not the way to bring them on side. And you might not like that, because you might think they're terrible people. But, if you actually care about changing the world, you do need to bring people on side. So even if you do think they're kind of terrible, maybe you need to put that to one side if it helps create the sort of change that you want to see. So I think there is that division on the left, and I think it's worrying, actually, that this very polarising, people who don't think exactly like me, who aren't from my tradition on the left, are terrible people. Gosh, I get this all the time coming from the Observer. Like, the Observer is terrible. The Observer cost Jeremy Corbyn the election in 2019, this sort of stuff. And I find it very worrying, because I think it is growing in dominance. So I think that's partly as a result of social media, actually, and the way that social media interacts with politics. But I think it's something that people on the left should be very, very worried about and thinking about, because I think institutions like the Labour Party, they have a responsibility to depolarise the debate on the left, rather than getting involved in a very sectarian way and kind of picking sides. And I think to be very sectarian is to sort of go down the route of losing elections for a very long time to come. So I guess just the final point I would end on would be, in terms of Labour thinking about how it wins, there's just a basic fundamental truth in Adam's presentation that we all know. You've got to get votes from people who voted for the other parties in the last general election, and you've got to get the votes of a lot of people who voted Conservative. That's just kind of basic. And I do think that the distribution of Labour's vote over those 9 tribes means that, well, first of all, just don't go down. And it's really interesting, all this speculation about how great Angela Rayner would be as leader of the Labour Party, because she's so great at the PMQs, and she's so great at landing a punch on Boris Johnson. Now, I'm ambivalent on whether Angela Rayner or not would make a good Labour leader, but I don't think that if she would, that's not what would make her a good Labour leader. Labour is not going to win the next election by being really good at telling the country about why everything is the Tories' fault. I personally think that what's going to happen over the next 3 years is unfortunately going to be economically really grim, but I think people will come to that conclusion themselves. Yeah. And they don't want a Labour Party whose primary thing is to say it's all the Tories' fault, it's all the Tories' fault. Labour will only win by presenting some sort of vision that appeals to people across those 9 tribes. And that's really difficult. I don't know how it's going to do that, but that is where the focus needs to be. And if Labour thinks we need somebody at the next election who's just brilliant at being a bruiser at P&Q, and I'm not personalising this to Angela Rayner, because I think Angela Rayner has got a lot of other really good qualities. Yeah. I just don't think that it's that one that should be, that Labour members should be thinking about when they elect the next leader of the Labour Party. So that's my sort of TP.
Thank you very much. Now, sets the stage very nicely for Stephen Kinnock, who's been taking notes assiduously during all that. Now, I haven't read them, but I'm going to tip you off, Stephen. If what you say next does not contain the word scum, and in response to it, I will ask you a question about it afterwards. So I leave it up to you whether or not you want to address that in your remarks now or in the questions that follow. Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you, James. Unusually fair of you to give me advance notice of what you're intending to say, so I'll take you up on the offer to delay for as long as I possibly can my answer to that. Brilliant presentations, both of them, and absolutely fascinating in terms of setting the stage for what we're looking at. I must say those 9 tribes did remind me of that famous scene in The Life of Brian, you know, the People's Front of Judea versus the Judean People's Front, and how strongly splitters all over the place, and it's just that film was in the 1970s, right? So it just shows that we continue to go around in these circles. I wanted to say a few words about Renaissance and the research that we've been doing, because I think it might help us then to move on to looking at some of those questions that Sonia in particular posed about, well, what does Labour do with all of this information, and what are the compelling stories about the future of our country that we need to be telling? Because I completely agree that just being able to bash the Tories as hard as possible is never going to win us a general election. A quick reminder of the mountain that we have to climb. We have to win an eye-watering 124 seats in order to secure a complete Labour majority, not having to work with any other party. 60% of those seats are in the North, the Midlands and Wales, and 104 in smaller towns rather than cities. So I think from that you can begin to extrapolate the kind of groups that we need to be looking at, particularly in terms of the research that was presented. And that's what we did with Renaissance, really, is focus on those areas of the country, and that group, I think it most closely correlates to what you call the common sense group there, and that's a very important point, because that is where the Conservatives are drawing a big chunk of their support. So we had conversations with 60 former Labour voters, people who stopped voting for the party in 2010, but most of them actually had stopped voting sometime between now and 2010. Most of them had stopped voting for the party in 17 and 19. They all said that they would consider voting Labour again if we changed as a party. Half of them were Leave voters. Majority were not graduates, and half were aged between 35 and 50. The other over 54 groups in the North and the Midlands, 3 in the South and 1 in North East Wales. So what we were looking at was, first of all, the values and the principles that drive those people. And we found that there were some very clear golden threads going through all of the groups. Very patriotic, people who feel that Britain is a great country with much to be proud of, believe strongly in personal responsibility and contribution, but versus excessive welfare, as many of them would say. Collective rights over individual rights, very important. Strongly identify as working people. Work is a really important part of what makes these people tick. And interestingly, as I think Sonia alluded to and others, culture wars didn't play a very big role in any of our conversations. We tried to tease out certain conversations around culture wars, wasn't a huge amount of interest. One of the other big threads going through is they can't stand politicians. They think politicians are in it for themselves, are self-serving, and I think that really reflects this not being particularly driven by strong political views. And they don't trust politicians to deliver on promises. The challenge we have as a party is that because of the fact that the Tories have been in power, they delivered Brexit. Whatever we think about Brexit, that is something that they certainly seen as having been delivered. Furlough, vaccine rollout, and a long-term reputation, rightly or wrongly, for economic competence. So there's you know, that's a big mountain for us to climb, because in all of those areas we have an issue with trust. And the big challenge then is, if we are operating in a vacuum where people are not entirely sure what the Labour Party stands for or who we stand for anymore, people will project that onto us, that the only thing you stand for is yourselves. And it's that self-interest piece that drives the way that people perceive politicians. If there's a vacuum, they will project that onto you. So that is very damaging, because that's the reason that we're finding it so difficult to get a hearing, I think. People are not going to open the door and start listening to you if they don't actually think they know what you stand for in the first place. So that's a huge part of the challenge that we have to address. So the key question then is, in terms of that group of people that I might call the common sense group that was presented to us earlier, there are some really important and encouraging opportunities for Labour, and I think that they are clustered around three main stories about the future of the country. One is about work. Labour has to make it absolutely clear that we are the party of work and good jobs. There is a clear sense that it is in the DNA of the Conservative Party to be quite happy about a race to the bottom, to take a laissez-faire approach, to let the market rip. And a lot of the people that we spoke with were saying, we don't think that's fair anymore. They had either themselves or their children or grandchildren were working very, very long hours for very poor pay, and felt that there was a lot of exploitation going on in the marketplace. So I think we're absolutely in the right space in terms of the New Deal for workers. And that, I think, is going to help us to identify with and show that we're listening to the priorities of the people that we're talking about today. The other is about economic competence and fiscal rectitude. There are profound concerns about Labour not looking after taxpayers' money. So this value for money piece, the stuff that Rachel Reeves is going to be talking about today, is absolutely crucial. What we need to start talking about is investing in order to save. So by investing in early years, investing in preventative measures, you are saving the taxpayer money in the long term. That is the way to frame an argument about fiscal responsibility. And the other final really story that resonated was about the need to be proud of Britain and what it is achieving and what it can achieve. We've got to sketch out a picture about the post-Brexit nation in which we live, that is about a country that can stand on its own 2 feet. There was a real sense of loss and deeply held view that this is a tragic situation we've got into, where we seem to be no longer a country that makes things, that we import so much from countries like China that are increasingly seen as dangerous and hostile regimes. And this is not at all about protectionism. It's about working and cooperating with our allies and being ready, of course, to compete on the global marketplace, but rebuilding our manufacturing sector, investing in those good jobs and skills that can bring industry back. But people were also very focused on the future. This wasn't sort of the old, let's go back to monolithic smokestacks and factories. It was about those new jobs. There was some interest in the green revolution, but it's not that argument needs to be made much more strongly if it's going to gain traction. But a really clear view that Labour should be talking about the national interest, about being a patriotic party that is going to build the best possible future for our country and for future generations. So overall, those are the 3 stories I think we could and should be telling about the country. Then, in order to break that cycle of cynicism that I talked about, the real disillusion and disconnect about politics, we need to settle on those stories and repeat. The biggest challenge that Labour has is we constantly jump around from one thing to another. We need to actually roll the dice on this stuff, settle on these clear, compelling narratives and repeat them, because that's the only way we'll start to get a hearing. And once people start listening, they might start looking at our policies. But until we've got past that initial wall of cynicism, we will not be getting a hearing on our policies. And the overall tone of that discourse, as Sonia absolutely rightly says, is it's got to be about persuasion, not purity. Any language which is around alienating people, looking down on them because they might not share exactly the same beliefs because they haven't been members of the Labour Party for the last 45 years. That is just going to burn support, and the wall of cynicism will be built even taller, and we will frankly never be able to scale it. So persuasion, not purity, please. Thanks for that.
Just before I go to your questions from all of you, you were forewarned, Susan. So you set yourself up with your closing remarks. You were just talking about the group of people who once upon a time voted Labour and then started voting Conservative. Thinking about those people, do you think that calling Boris Johnson scum makes it more or less likely that those people will vote Labour next time round?
James, I'll give you an answer,
Good.
which is based on where Labour wins. And Labour wins in Wales. And one of the reasons that we won so well in Wales at the elections in May is because of Mark Drakeford and his leadership. And Mark Drakeford is a person who exudes decency, integrity, moderation, measured language, listening to voters, showing them that Labour is on their side, that the Labour Party belongs to Wales. Wales does not belong to the Labour Party. And that is the way to win elections. It's as simple as that.
I think we get the point. Yes, thank you. Well, thank you very much. I won't trouble Adam and Sonia with more on that, because I've got lots of people here with questions. I think so. Might try and do you batches. In fact, we'll go. Should do three. The first three hands I saw. Chris Gold there, gentleman in the red t-shirt, and the gentleman in the check shirt. And I'll do three quick snappy questions, and a bunch of answers, and I'll come to next, please.
Thank you. I think intellectually we all know who the voters are that Labour need to target. However, as I think you pointed out, Labour voters and especially Labour members clearly have very strongly liberal views overall. How do we manage to appeal to those voters without appearing inauthentic in a kind of control immigration mug kind of way?
How do social liberals appeal to social conservatives authentically?
Thanks. In the May elections, it looked like the party of the nation, whether that's Labour in Wales, SMF in Scotland, Conservatives in England, Labour in London, won. And so is it pride in Britain, or is it pride in the nation?
Place.
One lower down, which flag is more important?
Hi there. My question is, how do different generations interplay into the common sense, different camps that Opinion set up, the nine tribes as it were?
Right, lovely. So we've got three tiny little questions there. One, how to get authenticity into politics. Two, how does nation, place and region interact with voting decision? And how do intergenerational differences affect voting? That's pretty simple to solve. You solve quickly. I don't know. Shall we go? Probably the best thing is, Adam, do you want to talk a little bit briefly about the tribes and the age stratification, and then maybe on the other two questions, we'll come to Sonia and Stephen on the authenticity and nation. Is that all right?
So the common sense group is, I mean, it's older than average, but it's massive. So it encompasses quite a wide range of different ages. To an extent, so I think it was 2017, and it was slightly less bad in 2019, but everyone's seen that chart which shows party vote share by age, and it's just two in second lines. It sort of plays out the way you would expect with the way these groups break down in terms of what their party preferences are and stuff like that. So I don't have the actual breakdown, but it's, for example, the algorithm group who are the more kind of UKP end of things. That's a lot more sort of older, retired. There's that fine line between sort of stereotypes and actually what a sort of demographic group is. But to a large extent, they do sort of break down the way you would expect.
There's also, this is not time conversation. There's also questions about education and whether or not how important education is. Essentially, short answer, you treat educational differences as more important than you do at the moment. You'll understand politics better. So the other two questions now were about authenticity and region, nation, and place. Sonia, how to you spoke brilliantly about the need to meet people where they are and understand them. How do you do that? How do you explain to people that while you disagree with them, you still respect them without it coming across as slightly inauthentic?
I thought that was a really excellent question. So I didn't catch your name. So
Christopher.
Christopher, I thought that was a really excellent question. And I suppose a really glib answer is not to adopt policies that you don't believe in just because you think other people will like them. But that is a really glib answer. I guess what I mean by that on a deeper level is I do think people can sniff inauthenticity a mile off, and they totally know if you're doing something that you're just doing it because you think it's going to get them to vote for you. I think voters can sniff that out very, very easily. I think actually it's more about focus on stuff that you kind of think is important for the country anyway, but that might be really resonant and important for those voters. And that's partly thinking about how you sell the stuff that you think is really important for the country in a way that will appeal to them. So some of the stuff I say, but I think one really obvious kind of area, for example, is crime. Labour should really, really care about crime. The fact that our criminal justice system is like in tatters. And I know people who they suffer crimes, not completely insignificant crimes as well, like quite significant burglaries, etc. And you literally, the police are too stretched, can't really get the police involved. If it's even more serious crime, I mean, the amount of time that people are waiting to go to court, and then the amount of time that actually was really unfair, obviously, on people who are found innocent at trial. But it's also pretty bad that there are some hardened criminals out there who are waiting for years as well. So I think Labour should go hard. Not hard on crime, but I think Labour should talk about crime in the sense of, maybe, I who came up with that word in relation to crime, James. But I do think it's a disgrace that actually our criminal justice system is so bad at the moment in terms of dealing with people, both victims and then people who actually commit crimes. And I actually think lots of people either have experience of that or know people who have experience of it in their streets, in their neighbourhoods, their communities. So I think Labour could talk about that quite effectively, actually, personally.
Thank you. I'm sorry. Brief digression. I was just remembering on the authenticity point, and I'm going to date myself a bit as a lobby correspondent of a certain vintage, but I remember the happy days of a certain Prime Minister, whose name we can't mention, of course, who, whenever he was asked about this stuff, would occasionally turn with a terrible grin and say, no, it's worse than that. I really believe this stuff. With that, authentically, I will hand over to Stephen Kinnock to talk about authenticity and flags.
Yes, well, we have to speak from the heart, and the electorate is not stupid. They can see when people are not being authentic and when they're just trying to put up a facade in order to go after their votes. But I think so much of that is about the story that we tell about the country, and to talk about the pride that we have in the country and the ambition that we have in the country. I genuinely hope there isn't a single member of the Labour Party that doesn't want to do that. And I certainly feel when I go out and talk to my constituents on the doorstep in my Aberafon constituency, we talk about how proud we are to be Welsh, and we talk about how much ambition we have for the country and for people's children and their grandchildren. We talk about the fact that work is not just about bringing home a paycheck at the end of the month. It's a source of dignity and self-respect and identity, and it contributes to your community, and it builds a better future for your family. So I think we have to be able to tell those stories with real passion, and if we feel it in our hearts, people will see that. I think we often have this debate, don't we, about the EU referendum and the Remain campaign and its failure to really set out an argument that appealed to people's hearts as much as their heads. We have to learn from that. We have to be a party that speaks to people's hearts, because you don't connect with their heads until you've connected with their hearts. And I think that there's a real opportunity around work, the dignity of Labour, the sense of identity and self-esteem that you get as a community and as a family, because there are good jobs in your community where young people don't feel that they have to go somewhere else in order to have a better future. Bringing that pride back to communities that have felt completely disconnected is a really big challenge for the party. It will mean that we've got to really think and understand about parts of the country where we don't have huge Labour Party membership anymore. I mean, you look at the membership of the party in Hackney compared to the membership of the party in Hartlepool. I don't know exactly what the numbers are, but I suspect by a factor of thousands there's more members in Hackney and Hartlepool. So there's a job of work for everybody in our party to do, which is to understand that we've got to broaden our message. But there's absolutely no reason why, if you talk about the dignity of Labour, that isn't something that could. There's an umbilical cord between every party member, whether it's Hartlepool or Hackney, in terms of that story. And from that, you start to build a picture about pride in Britain, yes, but also the pride that you have in the place that you live. So I think Labour, the clue is in the word. We are the party of work. We should be the party of jobs and good families. And I think if we can settle on that message and repeat it incessantly for the next year or two, we might actually get a hearing in the country.
Thank you. Now, it's housekeeping point. Stephen earlier on foolishly told me you could actually stay a little bit past the hour. So given there's lots of people here still to ask questions, if you will, I'll keep things going a little past the hour. Let's go. Will we get kicked out, Hannah? No,
There's no queue at the door.
Nobody's forcing us out. So we'll do another round. Before we do that, I warned you about show of hands again. I'm not going to do what I warned you. You're going to take up the challenge that was in Stephen's last comment. Put your hand up if you're proud to be British. Just checking. Thank you. Now, next round of questions. Who wants to go next? Right, the lady there, the lady gentleman in the front row, and the gentleman in the glasses there. So we'll start with the second row, then.
Hi, thank you. This has been very interesting. I just was wondering, you were talking about 3 stories around which Labour could create opportunities. I was wondering whether there could also be European vision, like a vision for the role of Britain in Europe.
Yeah, and then if you just go forwards. Yeah.
Thanks. Kevin Garrity from Bristol East. I was having seen the debate on the rule changes yesterday, and the amount of bile on the conference floor was, for someone who's not particularly experienced in conferences, was a bit shocking, really. So I was immeasurably cheered up with Sonia's example about equal marriage in the United States, because the research I've seen suggests that many democratic activists have an even bigger purity problem than we've got amongst our activists and our voters. So how the hell, in such a divided society, a polarised political climate, do they manage to pull off this? Because I'm sure if they can, we can get over a lot of our purity problems.
So, yes, ready to do it. And then the gentleman in the white shirt and glasses, far end of the fourth row.
We spoke a bit about the solutions and blaming. Really, I think just quickly, not just in politics, but life in general. I don't think it's always that important who's to blame for something, but rather the solutions. So you can have this distinction of blame or solutions. So I think it's very important to focus on the solutions part a lot more than the blaming part. And we've spoken quite a bit about Labour or authenticity, which is, well, no doubt important, but at the same time, you sort of look at the Tories and they're not exactly authentic in any real sense. I think they're the very opposite of authentic. So how can they, so the sort of like to pose, how can they kind of be inauthentic in a kind of successful way, but Labour can't be? I think it's like maybe like
to kind of just to bring it into a question. The question is, could I paraphrase your question as what can Labour learn from Tory success on the authenticity point?
Yeah. How can they be sort of
I'll do it. Good. So I'm trying to make sure everyone gets going. So quick summary. What can Labour learn from Tories around authenticity? What role for European identity in those key priorities, Stephen? And essentially, a very deep question. What lessons from America as to what works and what we mustn't do, I suppose. So these feel like more questions for Stephen and Sonia, but Adam, if you want to come in, do.
Yeah, so the comparison with the US is very accurate, because that's where we copied the questions from, so we just ran to the UK instead of in the US. The situation there is really different, but the main thing to compare the US and the UK with is that the UK basically has a sort of like the demographic breakdown of the US about 30 years ago, and the way that sort of plays across parties means that it's, they're in a slightly more like favourable situation than Labour is here. I think a lot of there was a lot of evidence that security problem did, hold Democrats back in lots of places, and especially all the sort of talk around, places like defund the police, for example, very, very prominent, which I think it has been shown has disadvantaged Democrats in lots of ways. So it has disadvantaged them, but they were in a sort of stronger situation in the first place, so they were able to absorb that a lot better than they were able to here.
Sorry, you were next one?
Yeah, sure. So first, I guess I'll take the one about blame, and I think you're right. I sort of hinted at it in kind of what I said. I think there are people on the left who are obsessed with the idea of blame and guilt and shame, and all of them can be helpful sentiments in the right circumstances. Blame, identifying, holding people accountable is important, particularly to changing things so bad things don't continue happening. But blame for blame's sake, it can feel quite, I suppose, validating if you think the other side have done stuff wrong, but it doesn't do very much. It's quite a thing that's about sort of, I think, making you feel good about your own sort of viewpoint, perhaps, rather than achieving much in the world. So I do think that the left needs to drop blame a bit more than it does at the moment with regards to the government, as difficult as that is to do when you look at the government and you see them getting so many things wrong. I just think you being the force that identifies it and saying it's all their fault doesn't necessarily act to convince people that it's all their fault, and kind of makes you look bad as well, even if that is the true state of things. That's what I'd say about that. In terms of how do you actually depolarise when things are so polarised? So I think, first of all, institutions have got a really important role to play. I think one of the issues with social media debates and the way that social media affects our politics is that when you get involved in quite a toxic, polarised debate on social media, and I'm thinking about one in particular, but I probably won't say what it is because I'll regret going there. But people can sort of start off taking quite reasonable positions, and then following 2 or 3 years of sort of relentless abuse from the other side, and I'm not talking about a particular side in a particular debate here, but it makes you take more and more extreme positions, and that is basic human psychology, it just is, and it's how radicalisation works. I'm not, it's hard to blame particular individuals for the state of the national debate about particular issues. It's institutions that have got a role, and actually I think the Labour Party's got a role in depolarising debates on the left, particularly identity issues. And quite frankly, I think it's failing because I think it's just too scared to get involved. So it either doesn't say anything or it picks a sectarian side, and that doesn't help anyone. So I think there are national institutions who are failing, who bear far more blame than particular individuals on social media for it. And I actually would hold the media as part of that as well, to be honest. I think the media doesn't play the role that it should in some ways. There was something else I was going to say as well about how you do it, but I can't remember what it was.
I'll say, speaking as a recovering journalist, I agree with you on the point about the responsibility of the media and on the subject. Steve, you were scribbling furiously on the European point. I think I'm reading a note, which is cheating. But...
Yeah, I should definitely get my writing a bit smaller when I sit next to you, James. Well, it was actually on the Europe point and the authenticity point, because I think they're connected. And they are connected by the fact that we took a position to campaign for a second referendum on the EU. And I'm sure there are people in this room that felt it was the right policy. I never did. I was always firmly opposed to it. You may know that I went for this very nuanced and compromised approach. The compromise word, again, of a common market 2.0. It's a Norway-based solution to the issue, because I felt that there was a real risk around the authenticity issue if we talk about democracy, but then try to overturn the result of the referendum. So I think that those two things impact on each other, and that is interestingly where the Tories are seen as being authentic by the people that we're talking about today, particularly because they delivered on the result of a referendum, and that has been the biggest democratic event in our country for a generation. So that is big and important factor in terms of this perceptions of authenticity. In many, many other areas, the Tories, I think, are seen as authentically inauthentic. People vote for them because they know that they are they don't have any principles. They're deeply sort of just expedient, pragmatic and Machiavellian, and they will do whatever it takes to stay in power, but people feel that kind of is baked in when they look at the Tories and their identity as a party. We can never win on that ground. We can never win on that basis. That is simply not what the Labour Party should be about, and it's not what the party is about. What we do have to do, though, is engage with the world as it is, not the world as we wish it was. And that means understanding why we've got some of these big challenges and issues that we've talked about today. In order to get over the hill around the Brexit challenge, we need a narrative which demonstrates that we believe passionately in Britain and in Britain's ability to stand on its own 2 feet post-Brexit. Once we've convinced people of that and we've got a hearing on that, then it is about saying, but by the way, a successful foreign policy isn't about how much you can bash the French. That's the way Conservative MPs think. That's the way the Conservative Party thinks. A successful foreign policy is about rebuilding those bridges with Europe that have been so badly burned. A successful foreign policy is about putting systems and processes in place which actually enable us to interact with the single market, 500 million consumers on our doorstep. Let's get real about this stuff. Let's get real about where Britain is in the world. The big challenge we have is because there are reservations about whether or not Labour is a patriotic party, whether we're a party that does actually act in the national interest, doesn't feel that it always needs a crutch to lean on, but rather is and that's not, I think, ever going to get us that hearing that we need to get. Once we've got that hearing, we need to then be setting out very clearly what we always have, which is we are a proudly internationalist and pro-European party. It's that patriotic internationalism, that balance of idealism and pragmatism. That's where we have to be as a party. And I think that's the story we have to tell about the future of the country. And I think that addresses the Europe question, and it also addresses the authenticity question.
James, I just remembered what I was going to say really quickly. So it was citizens' assemblies is the other way that you can depolarise. And I won't say too much about it now, but again, if you look at the issue of Irish abortion, there was a citizens' assembly on that. And it's amazing. If you take stuff away from politicians and give it to just ordinary people, their capacity to produce good, decent solutions that the majority of people can get behind, they're a bit of a compromise and don't satisfy the extreme of either side. It's quite extraordinary. And they did the same for Brexit. I think it was UCL or Kings that ran Brexit Citizens Assembly. And basically the public were like, essentially, why would we do a form of soft Brexit?
Yeah, thank you. One last round. Right, three. There's a lady there, chap in the red hoodie, and then the gentleman in the red coat there, and then okay, we'll do 4 because of the lady you come out at the end. So if I'll just test my memory and sharing skills, try and remember 4 questions. So go ahead, please.
Cool. Susie Stride from East London. Thank you, guys. I missed some of the speeches, so apologies if you guys have covered this. But you mentioned about persuasion, not purity. And I just wondered what you guys think we need to do around the fact that small aspects of our membership are a bit disconnected sometimes from where the electorate is and where the centre ground is. And i.e. some of the things we obsess about in GCs are possibly not what those people we are seeking to represent are talking about and what's going to change their lives. And what we do about that. So we've talked about it for years, but sometimes we need to have somehow we need to have a strategy of actually how we move into a new season with all of this stuff. You know, I ran in Harlow, which is a seat we have to win if we want to win the country. And after that election, I thought, maybe we just need to invite a voter that could have voted Labour, didn't, that voted Tory, to every GC in the country and get them to just share about why they didn't vote for Labour. So instead of us telling them why they were wrong.
Sorry, can I summarise that as a
that's the question.
How can members themselves change and adopt this persuasion not purity approach?
Yeah, and how we have a strategy around it. Thank you. Sorry for the speed.
The mic is going back to the gentleman in the red hoodie.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, there's been lots of talk about the authenticity of politicians, but what can the left do about the authenticity of voters? Because I think we all lie to ourselves in so many ways. And, you know, that like on benefits, people say they want benefit cuts, but then it's brought in and lo and behold, they become very unpopular. So tax credits were kicked out, the cuts to disability allowance, now the £20, etc. What does the left do about that?
Okay, so how do you fix the cognitive dissonance of the electorate? Okay, good. Gentleman in the red polo shirt.
Alec Lima, Richmond, RTLP. You've made the case that there's no consensus in social issues. You've also made the case, Sonia, in the research you cited, that there's a consensus in disaffection with income and wealth disparities. The common denominator is that people aren't being paid what they're worth. So it's a question of how do you get wages up, get growth in the economy, and give the potential customers of aspiring entrepreneurs customers with disposable income.
So the question arises from
the question, therefore, is, given that shareholders don't own companies, is there scope for focusing on a proposal that Labour Business put into a conference motion that said a more equal distribution of wealth and economic power is needed, which is the purpose of the Labour Party, and quite critically, reform corporate governance so all stakeholders, including communities.
This is Section 117 of the Companies Act.
James. Reform corporate governance so all stakeholders, including communities, employees and unions, have a say in how the big companies are run.
So corporate governance reform. Advertising, if you'd like to come to the Snug in the Harbour Hotel at 2:30, there's an SMF seminar on reform of Section 172 of the Companies Act and corporate governance and the role it could play in better capitalism. So I'm going to bring the microphone forward.